Olá, pessoal. Tudo bem, and welcome to the Brazil Crypto Report podcast, where we talk to the builders, entrepreneurs, and influencers from across the Brazil ecosystem. I'm your host, Aaron Stanley, and today I'm joined by Leo Schwartz, who is a reporter covering crypto, policy, and regulation at Fortune. And he's also the author of the excellent Proof of State newsletter, which you should read if you don't already. We're going to take a slightly belated look at Web Summit Rio, which took place the first week of May. I was not able to be there in person, unfortunately. Leo, on the other hand, was in attendance. He moderated a couple of sessions and he was able to mingle with some of the representatives from the local industry. And he also wrote a very nice recap article about his experience. So I thought it would be nice to invite him onto the show so he could tell us a bit more about kind of what he learned. So with that, I'd like to welcome Leo to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, so why don't you give us just a bit of background about yourself and kind of how you got into crypto, just to get started here.
Definitely. So I'm a reporter at Fortune. I cover crypto, mostly looking at policy and regulation, but as you know, it's a space that has everything in it, from the fun financial crimes to hacks to just general technology. And my interest in crypto came pretty untraditionally. I was a reporter at a place called Rest of World before this, which is a nonprofit newsroom that covers tech outside the US. So I was actually based in Mexico, mainly focused on Latin America. But as a Spanish speaker, I will say that Brazil was certainly a blind spot. And as you know, crypto is a very different story in Latin America as it is in other markets, and especially in the US, where I think it's less about speculation and more about actual use cases, whether it's remittances or cross-border payments in general, or hedges against inflation, or anything in between. So I covered a lot about Mexico and Venezuela and Argentina. And when I got the invite to come to Web Summit Rio, I was really eager to learn more about the ecosystem because I'd heard about this budding regulation that was happening in the country. And as a regulatory reporter in the US, the story is basically that regulation is completely stalled. All the lawmakers are at an impasse. All the agencies hate each other. So whenever I get the opportunity to look at a market where it actually seems like regulation is progressing, it's always great.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's covering regulation in the U.S. it's kind of like Groundhog's Day, right? Where like every day just sort of feels exactly the same. It's like another Bitcoin ETF rejection. It's another SEC regulating by enforcement decision. It's another round of companies sort of threatening to leave the U.S. if they don't get what they want, and it's just kind of the same wheel keeps on turning for years and years and years, it seems. But yeah, so what's happening in Brazil is actually quite refreshing in that perspective. So, would love to hear just a bit about kind of how was Web Summit? What were you doing in your official capacity at Web Summit? Like, what was? I know you did a couple of panels, but maybe just give us some more color about like your experience there.
Yeah, definitely. So as a tech reporter, before I'd heard about Web Summit a lot, but I'd never actually been able to go. So it was very cool to be invited to this Web Summit. Also in Rio, I'd never been to Brazil. And I was invited to moderate a couple panels. One was on privacy and technology with Chelsea Manning, who's now working on NIM, which is like a privacy infrastructure crypto provider. And then the other was one that was more in my wheelhouse, which was basically the state of crypto regulation, but looking at Brazil, with a lot of fantastic panelists, including Marcelo from Hashdex and Jose from CoinExt. So I think before the panel, I got to learn a lot about basically the regulatory position in Brazil. I remember when I first, Hashdex has been on my radar for a while, just because ETFs are such a big question in the US. So the fact that Bitcoin ETF had been approved in Brazil definitely piqued my interest. So I'd spoken to him before, and I remember prepping for the panel and my first conversation with him, where he was basically like, "Yeah, the legislature has passed a law. It seems like the president's going to sign it, and regulation's going to be implemented." I was almost in shock that something could be that far forward. I mean, I know there are some markets where that's the case. Like Europe is finalizing MiCA now. Obviously, you have the Bahamas who have implemented regulation, maybe not too successfully. You have UAE that has different states of regulation, but for it to be in Latin America and for it to be in this very different context than we're used to was really interesting. So getting to actually come to Web Summit, speak with the people in person. I went to Hashtown, which is I don't know if you've been there, but it's like the crypto co-working space / Hashdex headquarters in Leblon. Beautiful
Did you
location.
get a Bitcoin burger at the crypto kitchen
I
upstairs?
went for the happy hour that they hosted, and they had lots of very delicious food. Also wild that I think it's a Michelin-starred chef who started it, which was surprising. A lot of the crypto-themed restaurants in the US, I would say, are not up to the same standard.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I had the first sort of impression when I went there the first time as well. I was like, this is actually much higher quality than I was, than what I've been led to believe of, or my traditional sort of view of crypto restaurants is generally like shady, like pizza place that accepts Bitcoin or something, and not necessarily like a Michelin star, fancy place. But yeah, so very cool. Also, sounds like you really got the full sort of like Rio crypto experience. Then you got the not just at the conference itself, but got to do some of the side events and whatnot. Maybe talk a bit more about just like who else from the ecosystem did you get a chance to talk with? I mean, obviously Hashdex is kind of like the crown jewel. I mean, full disclosure or full shameless plug, I guess. Like everyone listening, you should take a listen to my most recent podcast with Bruno Ramos de Souza of Hashdex. If you haven't listened to that already. But like, what other interesting maybe projects or companies or people from the Brazil ecosystem were you able to chat with that you found particularly interesting?
So Parfin was another interesting one. I mean, I think the question for me is basically when you look at something like Hashdex or even Parfin, it can transcend the country itself or the borders, I guess, itself, where they're offering a service that can be offered in different markets. So I think my question with this really was, even if Brazil can implement this regulation, does that actually mean that Brazil can compete as a global hub and can attract global entrepreneurs or global customers? Obviously, another market in Latin America, El Salvador, has really positioned itself in that vein, saying like, not only are we going to have Bitcoin as legal tender, but because of this freedom we're offering, we're going to attract companies from all over the world to come build in El Salvador. I don't think they've really been successful for a number of reasons. Obviously, you've seen a lot of tourism there, but I don't know if it's really attracting that many companies. So I think with Brazil, the question is, will that be the case? And I think what I really learned from speaking with people, I mean, a lot of people at Hashdex and also Parfin, and I think some other like, Sandra at Global Blockchain Council, who I know is very involved in Brazil. The question is basically, can Brazilian entrepreneurs build products that will be used globally, as opposed to will it actually attract entrepreneurs from other countries who are going to come into Brazil and build, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, the question is like, is it going to be like a two-way street or like a two-lane bridge essentially, where it's, you have service providers and exchanges that are looking to enter into the market just because it's so big and it's presents such a big opportunity. But then what's the potential of kind of some of the homegrown talent to potentially, be competitive in other markets? And this is, I mean, you've been covering Latin America for a while, right? So this applies to basically any industry, right? Like, I mean, obviously kind of the history of import substitution sort of, economic development philosophies has created kind of these local, like sheltered industries that are not exactly competitive elsewhere, just because, they don't necessarily need to compete elsewhere. But then in Brazil, you have a few examples of obviously some things like, kind of like Embraer and some of these, and even, and some of these other kind of, companies that have thrived in kind of the import substitution mindset. But I mean, not to totally digress from, the point at hand here, but I think this is an issue. This is an issue that always kind of comes up when you're talking about economic development in Latin America, where it's like, okay, how are we like generating entrepreneurs and companies that are actually going to be competitive in the global marketplace and not just kind of like, I mean, like recolonizing with like, North American and European and Asian companies that are kind of coming in for, in a gold rush kind of mentality, essentially seeing a new market to sort of capitalize on. But like, I would love to actually, kind of take, I mean, since you're more of like, I feel like I'm kind of like the opposite of you, where like I'm a Brazilianist, but I don't really know anything about the rest of Latin America. And sounds like you're kind of the opposite. So would love to kind of just pick your brain on like, what are you seeing maybe like elsewhere in the Latin American region? You mentioned El Salvador earlier, but is there anything else in particular that you found kind of particularly interesting on the crypto front? or on or either crypto generally, or maybe more regulation and policy more specifically?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to your earlier point. I do think you see a lot of Latin American companies that compete in Latin America or expand in Latin America, like Rappi or Mercado Libre, that don't necessarily expand outside of Latin America. And I do, I think Brazil obviously has the opportunity to become the crypto hub within Latin America. I don't know if you would call that Mexico now. I mean, Argentina obviously has a hotbed of companies, but it seems like that's happening with Brazil, but also that they're producing companies that are now also going abroad, which is not as common for Latin American tech companies like Hashdex, which is offering its services in Europe too. So, because crypto, I think, is more borderless, it offers that opportunity. And then, I mean, elsewhere in Latin America, I mean, Bitso, I really think is the big player, and it's sort of fascinating to see, Bitso, which has been competitive, especially in Mexico, I think, in Argentina and other markets across Latin America, has really expanded to Brazil and is challenging a lot of the Brazilian exchanges. I know Daniel Vogel, who I believe is the CEO, he's one of the founders, has moved to Brazil. So it's surprising to me that they think they can compete there. And I think it's also indicative of the fact that they recognize that Brazil really is this burgeoning hub. I mean, when you talk about regulation in other markets, if you look at Mexico, obviously they passed their fintech law before AMLO came to power. I think there's questions as to how successfully it's been implemented. I know it's facilitated a lot of fintech development, but even so, there's a lot of red tape that I think has restricted the growth of fintech companies in crypto there, even though you do see players like Bitso. Argentina obviously is another country where there's been a huge amount of crypto growth just because of the inflation problem there. But their government has been cracking down. I mean, you saw that Mercado Libre had implemented crypto buying tools on I think it was on like right on Mercado Pago, like you could buy and hold Bitcoin. But I know Argentina is now cracking down on that and trying to limit the ability of companies to offer crypto tools. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Venezuela is another interesting case where you've really seen crypto built into the economy in a lot of ways because of issues with their economy and hyperinflation, but it's also happening in this very gray market area where it's certainly not facilitated by the law, but it exists. I don't even know how to put it. Like they have an agency that manages crypto, but a lot of it is happening in a very shady way, obviously in a way that doesn't really spur innovation. And then I think the last example is El Salvador, which, really looked to crypto as a way to, I think, change the narrative of the country. I reported a feature from there a couple years ago and spent some time there. But obviously with the falling price of Bitcoin, I think that project has been hurt along with just the autocratic nature of Bukele in general.
Yeah, the El Salvador. I mean, I haven't actually been there myself, so it's one of these things where I've kind of reserved judgment on it until like I actually go there to see it for myself. But it's one of these things where like whoever you talk, if you talk to the Bitcoin maxis, like, oh, it's the greatest thing ever. If you talk to, sort of more sort of sensibly minded people, perhaps like yourself, they're kind of like, yeah, it's not really working out as they planned it would. But I feel like it's one of these things where it's like, it's going to be like, it's going to be they're playing the long game, I guess. So I'm kind of reserving. I mean, it's a fascinating experiment, and I hope they can succeed with it. But I guess I have my skepticisms the same as you on that front. And on the Bitso example, that's another really interesting one. I mean, I've had Daniel Vogel on the show a couple of times actually, and his story of kind of identifying that they really need to just go all in on the Brazil market from scratch. Basically, they didn't acquire anybody or anything. They just kind of came in greenfield and just started building. And they've been able to generate some decent traction. I mean, they're definitely one of the most used exchanges, and they've been pretty. They're actually very hands-on involved in the passage of the crypto law that passed back in December. I mean, it was basically like them. It was basically like Bitso and kind of Mercado Bitcoin, and then there's an association basically of maybe like 15, 20 other companies, but it was really kind of Mercado Bitcoin and Bitso that were driving that. And Bitso's kind of employed that in other countries as well. They've been very aggressive, or maybe aggressive isn't like the right word for it, but they've been very like proactive on kind of getting ahead of the regulatory curve in some of these countries. And maybe I guess there's another question here. and I guess just kind of going back to what we were talking about before about, basically exporting talent and companies from the region that can be competitive globally. From what you know of, Parfin and like Hashdex and some of these others that you met with, just kind of curious as to your thoughts on how viable do you think these companies are going to be kind of in the global landscape? Obviously Hashdex, it's like they've got, 5, 6, 7. I'm not even sure how many ETFs they have up and running now. But if you compare it to like something like Grayscale, it's like, okay, that's still kind of a drop in the bucket compared to some of the North American asset managers and whatnot. But and then Parfin, they're doing some very impressive things on the infrastructure front. They've got kind of a full sort of end-to-end solution. If you got clients outside, North America, Europe. But I guess we'd be kind of curious as to like what you know about these companies and maybe others. How viable do you think? Like how they're kind of the crown jewels of the Brazil market, but how well will these translate into other markets ultimately?
Yeah, well, Hashdex is the really interesting one because you bring up Grayscale, and Grayscale is currently embroiled in this legal fight with the SEC, and I know it's a case I've been following and covering pretty closely. And I know there's a lot of optimism among the crypto crowd in the U.S. that Grayscale will succeed in the case, and then basically be able to offer this Bitcoin spot ETF, which will dramatically change the market. But it seems really unlikely that that's going to actually happen, because even if they win this case, then the SEC would basically have to still agree to implement the ETF or approve the ETF. And it seems like it could be that they'll just reject the other one, which is the futures ETF that they've basically been forced to approve. This is really going down a legal rabbit hole that I'll try to limit. But I think the upshot here is that it seems like Grayscale's future is pretty existentially threatened. Whereas Hashdex has been able to find markets like Brazil, and in Europe, I'm pretty sure it's Switzerland. I don't know if they'll be able to expand with Mika now. But basically they have a viable product. And as I think they've identified, there is a lot of appetite among both institutional and retail investors for this safer exposure to crypto. It does seem like with the expertise they have, they would be able to compete with the Grayscale on the global scale, or by being able to identify countries where they can operate. So it really does seem like Hashdex has been able to transcend Brazilian borders to become a more global company. And, I think the question with everything is basically it's really unclear at this point how regulation is going to proceed in any given region. So much will depend on how regulation proceeds both in the US and European markets, across Africa, across Asia. It's really anybody's guess. And that's why I think they probably invest so much money in their legal and regulatory experts. And then, yeah.
And then I think the interesting thing with Hashdex in particular is that they've, and I was chatting about this actually with on my most recent podcast with Bruno from Hashdex. We were chatting about this, and in the US you've just heard this debate endlessly since like 2013 when the Winklevoss twins first tried to launch their own Bitcoin ETF and they kept getting rejected. And there's always this debate from kind of the Bitcoin crowd. It's like, well, ETFs are a terrible idea because it's just going to bring in all this kind of like financialization and rehypothecation and it's like, if you want to own Bitcoin, just buy it in self-custody. Like you don't need to buy a share of an ETF. And there, this debate was kind of had like ad nauseum back and forth for 10 years basically up until now. And there's been no one's been able. There's no ETF, so there's no way to prove anyone right or wrong, right? So the debate kind of just keeps on going. But with the Hashdex ETFs, they've got a Bitcoin ETF, but they've also got a number of other ETFs that are kind of other baskets of other assets. And I think they've proven that you can really having these ETFs, these products does really expand the market, right? So like there is a class of people and institutions that are interested in getting exposure to Bitcoin, but they don't want to like buy it and hold it themselves, right? So I found that particularly interesting about their example, and I think that's something that people tend to like. Most people don't even have any idea that there's like 12 different crypto ETFs trading on the publicly traded on the stock exchange here in Brazil. But I think that's one of the interesting things that's happening here is it's really just proven that these types of products do actually expand the market. And I think ultimately will be, sort of good for the market and prices and whatnot if you're able to bring in these new customers. But I mean, maybe just kind of thinking here on going back to the regulation side here. You kind of hinted at this in your introduction, where you're mentioning that look, regulation is generally in large countries around the world, regulation on this stuff does not move very quickly. I think places like Bahamas or Bermuda, or kind of the places you would expect to be the the first movers, and kind of the early adopters of this, have really kind of they've all got their own things in place. But Brazil's a bit of an anomaly in the sense that it's the seventh largest, more or less seventh largest economy in the world, 200 million people. It's a G20 country. There's not a whole lot of other sort of commonalities here with other G20 countries, I guess, as far as implementing this. I mean, have you seen any other? I mean, I know we have MICA in Europe, or MICA, however you pronounce it, which has just kind of gone through, which I'm not super well versed on. So, but if you want to talk a bit about maybe if there's some commonalities between MICA and what's happening in Brazil, or if there's other kind of large economies that you maybe have seen kind of some similar momentum building, I mean, that might be kind of helpful context here.
Yeah, I think there are different markets where you're basically seeing the governments grapple with how a licensing regime would work or how guardrails could be implemented. And you have places like Abu Dhabi and Dubai, which are starting to have those licensing authorities. Singapore, Hong Kong is vying to become a hub in those ways. But as you mentioned, to have as large an economy as Brazil and to have this process really democratically implemented, in my estimation, doesn't really have any parallels except for maybe with the European Union. So it is pretty groundbreaking in that regard, and I do think has been flying pretty under the radar, which is surprising. Then again, I think it goes back to that point of, will this turn Brazil into a regional hub or into a global hub? Because it always comes back to, finance is a global story, but if you're someone with a lot of money to park somewhere, I don't know if the regulatory situation will mean that basically you can find a custody provider in Brazil, or if you'll see basically the rise of companies like, I think, like Parfin, which are basically offering more like infrastructure and custody as a service, where because those companies can now thrive in Brazil, maybe then they could expand more globally. But in terms of where you're seeing regulation emerge to that degree, I think it's still really early innings across the world, and Brazil is certainly a leader in that space.
And maybe I'd like to, since we're both gringos here who have an interest in Latin America, but maybe would love. I mean, I have my own personal opinions on this question, but would love to kind of get your thoughts on why is it that what happens in this region, it kind of it always flies under the radar of kind of the Western developed world or whatnot. Why is it that I mean, aside from El Salvador, that's definitely not flying under the radar, but what's happening in even what's happening in Argentina now. I mean, you've got, I mean, the price of Bitcoin in Argentina now is it's twice, it's 100% higher what it is in spot markets in the US because there's just so much, demand for it there. But just your thoughts on, somebody who's kind of pretty familiar with the region, why is it that everything just kind of flies under the radar here? What does it take to sort of get people's attention?
It's a great question. It's something I definitely grappled with a lot when I was covering Latin America for, 3 or 4 years. I would like to say a lot of it comes to laziness from readers, but I think a lot of it's also on journalists to try and show why it's relevant. And again, if for better or for worse, a lot of what happens in Latin America is sort of siloed within Latin America, except for the stories that do always break through to the US, which are usually, unfortunately, about immigration. When you're looking at that economic story, like you said before, it's really often a one-way story of a lot of the companies from the US going to Latin America, and usually less so in the other direction, if you're looking at it from a business story. So I don't know. I mean, this is why I was interested in covering crypto when I was more focused on tech in Latin America, because I do think it's such a different story. And I think there's a lot that the US market can learn from what's happening in Latin America, both in terms of, the potential of crypto for cross-border payments, and as a hedge against inflation in these sort of wacky implementations like El Salvador, which I do think got a ton of attention, but mainly because Bukele is a particularly good salesman. And yeah, I mean, with this story, I do think it makes a little sense why Brazil is not necessarily breaking through, because, as I as I keep repeating through this, it's still a question of whether it will be able to compete as a global hub or actually produce products that will be relevant to larger markets like the US or Europe or Asia. I think some of that's probably a language barrier. I think some of it's because, the Brazilian currency is not an international currency, as I mentioned in the piece. Maybe other restrictions that you're probably more familiar with in terms of why those companies can't necessarily break through outside of Latin America. But again, with crypto, I think, my main angle or frame into it is still, crypto hasn't really found that use case that breaks through to the mainstream. That's why ETFs are interesting, I think, because I don't think the average person wants to go on, some sort of sketchy exchange and open an account and buy some Bitcoin. It'd be much easier to just buy it right through your normal investing account. So if an ETF's readily available, then maybe that's one use case. Uh, but these other ones that are happening in Latin America are much clearer than anything that you're seeing in the US, especially with cross-border payments, remittances, hedges against inflation, et cetera. So I do think those are the learnings that can break through. And, if Brazil can manage to implement this regulation and you see a lot of innovation flourish, then I do think it'll become a bigger story outside of Brazil.
Yeah, it's a really good point you made about the ETFs, where it's there's really not any that's like the only real product that an average sort of consumer or investor could use, right? Or could get exposure to crypto or utilize crypto in some fashion. Because it's like, we've been on this endless quest for sort of, improved UX and product market fit and all these things. But we end up even like as we're recording this, we just had this whole kind of ledger update debacle yesterday, right? Where everyone's like, oh, don't keep your Bitcoin on exchanges. You got to self-custody it. So it's like, okay, I bought a ledger and then to self-custody it. Now you're telling me that I can't use the ledger because, it's like, wait a minute, what am I supposed to do? So yeah, it's definitely not really ready for prime time at this point. But the use cases are, in Latin America, as you mentioned, are like the value proposition is much more obvious, right? And you even see this in some of the kind of the chain analysis, the sort of state of crypto, global crypto report or adoption index that they do, where you look at like Venezuela and it's basically all the crypto, or they've kind of identified the majority of the crypto transactions there as just being peer-to-peer, right? Whereas in a place like Brazil, where there's already pretty well functioning payment systems, but probably the best in the world, actually, instant payment systems. You don't really need to pay for stuff in Bitcoin, right? Like you can use PIX or you can use, so Bitcoin is much more of like an investment vehicle or an inflation hedge or just, a speculative asset, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But maybe one last question for you here while I have you. And this will be like a little bit long-winded, but I'll bring it back home here. But basically, ever since, as long as I've been in crypto, I mean, I've kind of been in and out of crypto since like, 2013, give or take. It took a few years off during the Mount Gox era when it looked like it was dead. But basically ever since that time, like there's always been this sort of implicit or explicit threat by the industry in the US, where they're basically saying like, we need, better regulations or we're just going to go overseas. Right. So you had that, even in like 2013, 14, when it came to things like money transmission licensing, which, granted, I fully understand the pain points of like having to go, why you'd have to, why you wouldn't want to have to go to every single, all 50 states to apply for a money transmission license, which just seems like a ridiculous policy and totally inefficient. So I totally understand why people wouldn't want that. And then, 2017 comes, we have the ICO boom and, we start getting some crackdowns from the SEC on, basically, the whole question of like, is this thing a security or commodity or something else? And, companies are saying like, okay, we can't, if you're not going to let us sort of issue coins and, to retail investors with freely, then we're going to just, we're just going to take off and go somewhere else where we can do that. Right. And then now it's like, it's kind of the same conversation just keeps repeating of companies basically threatening to leave the US. And now you have like Coinbase and Gemini, they're actually doing that. Like they've actually set up like offshore, derivatives exchanges in Bermuda. And there's going to be there's a whole Coinbase lawsuit in the works now. And, and so I guess the question is, okay, like is this real this time? Like, will they actually leave, or is this just like negotiating leverage. And if they do leave, where are they going to go, right? Obvious destinations are going to be like, places like Japan or Asia or Hong Kong, or, obviously Europe. Now things are kind of getting a bit more clear there. But then the other, tail end of that question would be, how viable would a place like Brazil or, potentially other places in Latin America, if they kind of follow suit with, they've kind of followed in Brazil's footsteps, how viable are these locations for companies that are kind of looking to sort of risk manage, I guess, away from the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a great question. It does seem like a lot of it's a negotiating tactic, or not even that. I mean, I've spoken with, I covered the Gemini launch, their offshore derivatives exchange, and I spoke with the Winklevoss twins about it, and I've spoken with Coinbase, and Circle is another one. They're moving more to Europe, and I think when you speak with all of them, they say basically, we're not planning on leaving the U.S. It's more that they're looking globally, which I think makes sense anyway. So much of crypto is a global story, and a lot of their customer base is going to have to be global for them to survive. In terms of the viability of the US, I mean, at the end of the day, it still is the economic powerhouse. And I don't think it makes a lot of sense for companies to really completely pull up their roots and move. And I do think a lot of regulation is cyclical, and who knows what we're going to see if there's another administration, if Gensler's not leading the SEC anymore. Everything seems very dramatic in a 1 to 2 year spurt. But like you said, it's going to be over a time horizon that these things really develop. And, then if you are seeing either smaller companies or companies that are just starting spring up around the world, it's a great question that I don't really have a good answer for where that's going to happen. It would be fascinating if you see a place like Brazil emerge as a hub, especially if they can build companies that aren't just serving Latin America. But right now, it really seems like where a lot of the money, at least, is moving is places in the UAE. It seems like a lot of development is happening in East Asia, Southeast Asia, where there is more clear regulation. And Europe, different places in Europe. I mean, I know Switzerland has become a big hub. The UK is vying for this. But at the end of the day, I think the US is still the number one in that market. And we're going to see that barring any incredibly significant regulatory crackdowns here.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summation, right? The U.S. is just so massive that you can't like abandon it, right? But at the same time, it's not, how viable is it to end up having these kind of like sheltered U.S. entities like your Binance and your Binance US, so your FTX and FTX US. Obviously, neither of which exist anymore, but well, they might come back. They might be Frankenstein FTX, sans Sam Bankman-Fried. But anyway, it's a great point. Like it's probably still too early, a little too early to tell to see where all the activity ends up. But you have a lot of pretty serious competitors vying for some of that activity right now. And then, if assuming, in 2 years, Gensler's gone and there's like a new administration, things in the US might clean up a little bit. But it's still a little, that in crypto years, that's like 20 years from now, right? So it's like, it's like trying to predict, like what temperature will the world be in, 2050 or something, right? It's like, it's kind of impossible, or, it's not easy to do. Well, anyway, Leo, thanks for coming on the show. Maybe I'll give you the last word, and maybe just give listeners, like, if they want to get in touch with you, like, what's the best way to get in, to get in touch, and maybe what would you be interested in hearing from people about?
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to hear more about projects that are emerging in Brazil, especially ones that are looking beyond the Brazilian market. I am very eager to continue following the passage of the law and what happens next. I think June, it seems like, is the next step for that. So if there's any policy experts there in Brazil, or if you have any governmental listeners, please get in touch. Twitter is usually the best way. I'm at Leo M. Schwartz, as long as the platform survives. Happy. My email is on the my profile page at Fortune. What was the other question? I don't know. I think something to leave with. I mean, obviously I'm at Fortune now and I'm mainly covering the US, but I really came to crypto as a global story. And I think whenever we can shed light on markets that aren't often looked at by, Fortune or Financial Times or Wall Street Journal or CoinDesk, it's great. I will say CoinDesk does some of the best global coverage I've read. So I really respect them for that. And hope to just keep learning about what's happening in Brazil.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show, and thanks everyone for watching, and we will see you next time.
Thanks so much, Aaron.